Greetings, this is Brian Alexander, and welcome to my latest Trump and Academia vlog report. I initially started doing this weekly, aiming for publication on Fridays, but things have developed at such a fast pace that I now have to offer them more frequently. If you're new to this series, these videos are where I summarize what the Trump administration has been doing to higher education and how colleges and universities have responded. It's a little different from my usual video work, which focuses on the future of higher ed and the future in general. So here are the latest developments as of today, March 12th, 2025. What follows is going to be formally very simple. No images or creative audio tracks or fancy editing, just me sharing the news, which I've organized into 4 categories: federal level, campus cuts, DEI, and climate change. There are copious links in the show notes. So let's begin at the federal level. I'll break these down by departments and offices. The Department of Justice is sending its federal task force to combat anti-Semitism to visit 10 universities. Remember the tour that we mentioned last week? One of those campuses has just been hit hard. As part of this, 4 agencies, the U.S. Departments of Education, Health and Human Services, Justice, and the General Services Administration, have just cut funds that they've been giving to Columbia University. The total amount? $400 million. Now, meanwhile, the Department of Education, the Trump administration has just cut the total staff by nearly 1/2. Secretary McMahon claimed that despite this reduction in force, or RIF, quote, the department will continue to deliver on all statutory programs that fall under the agency's purview, including formula funding, student loans, Pell Grants, funding for special needs students, and competitive grant making, unquote. Elsewhere, she added, quote, asked on Fox News whether the layoffs were the first step to a total shutdown, McMahon said, yes, actually it is, because that was the president's mandate, as directed to me clearly, is to shut down the Department of Education. She went on to describe the layoffs as eliminating what I think of as bureaucratic bloat, unquote. As a small sample of how this massive cut may play out, the Office of Civil Rights won't be able to do as much work or as efficiently. According to ProPublica, its locations in Boston, Chicago, Cleveland, Dallas, New York, Philadelphia, and San Francisco are being shuttered. Elsewhere in the Department of Education, there's been an update on the Dear Colleague DEI letter, which I've spoken about before, and this update comes in the form of a FAQ, frequently asked questions. Now, there's a lot going on in that FAQ. Again, there's a link in the show notes, including an attempt to restrict race and college application essays and a description of how the Office for Civil Rights will be able to investigate. But I was struck by this effort to guide when an academic can and cannot speak about race. And this is a little long, so bear with this. Quote, the more extreme practices at a university, such as requiring students to participate in privilege walks, segregating them by race or presentations and discussions with guest speakers, pressuring them to participate in protests or to take certain positions on racially charged issues, investigating or sanctioning them for dissenting on racially charged issues through DEI or similar university offices, mandating courses, orientation programs, or trainings that are designed to emphasize on focus on racial stereotypes, and assigning them coursework that requires them to identify by race and then complete tasks differentiated by race, all are forms of school-on-student harassment that could create a hostile environment under Title VI. Moreover, schools must not discriminate against students based on race in how they discipline or sanction students in response to complaints or allegations of harassment, or in response to speech that will be protected under the First Amendment, whether through use of bias response teams, mandatory trainings, or compelled statements, unquote. And there's a lot going on there, but that's a pretty detailed deep dive into what was a pretty vague Dear Colleague letter. My thanks to YouTuber Change1820 for asking about this. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the Education Department, it announced that it's investigating 60 campuses for anti-Semitism. These include research universities, state universities, and small liberal arts colleges, all of which right now, based on what's happening at Columbia University, are probably pretty nervous. At the same time, the president issued an executive order to the Department of Education calling on it to redefine the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program. Now, this program has served millions of graduates, and Trump wants to make sure it doesn't cover graduates working in enterprises that, quote, engage in activities that have a substantial illegal purpose, unquote. Such purposes include aiding illegal immigration, gender reassignment surgery, supporting terrorism, and also, quote, engaging in trespassing, disorderly conduct, public nuisance, vandalism, and obstruction of highways, unquote. It's easy to see a number of institutions covered here, including nonprofits. Elsewhere in the government, viewers might recall the Trump administration's efforts to pause or cut National Institutes of Health funding. A district judge in Boston just blocked the government from doing this. Now, over to the Department of Homeland Security. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, agents arrested Mahmoud Khalil, who recently graduated from Columbia University and was a leading pro-Palestinian activist there. Things are chaotic now, but it seems that ICE initially tried to revoke his student visa, then, learning he was no longer a student, revoked his green card. As of now, as far as I can tell, no agency has formally charged Khalil with anything. And he is either being held in Louisiana or New Jersey or New York or elsewhere. But various Trump administration officials have spoken of deporting him because of his support for Hamas. Now, President Trump celebrated the arrest on Truth Social, describing Khalil as, quote, a radical foreign pro-Hamas student, unquote. He went on to describe the event as the first in a series to come. Quote, this is the first arrest of many to come. We know there are more students at Columbia and other universities across the country who have engaged in pro-terrorist, anti-Semitic, anti-American activity, and the Trump administration will not tolerate it. Many are not students, they are paid agitators. We will find, apprehend, and deport those terrorist sympathizers from our country, never to return again. If you support terrorism, including the slaughtering of innocent men, women, and children, your presence is contrary to our national and foreign policy interests, and you are not welcome here. We expect every one of America's colleges and universities to comply, unquote. Now, that point about foreign policy interests is a reference to one law. I have a link to a pretty good legal analysis, which breaks that down in the show notes. Now, a New York district judge, Jesse Furman, blocked the deportation. And in response, again, this is developing really quickly, there have been many protests, from demonstrations to one petition I saw online which has more than 1 million signatures, to public statements. Here I just want to share 2 academic responses, starting with Camille Jaffer, Executive Director of the Knight First Amendment Institute at Columbia University. And his response is, quote, arresting and threatening to deport students because of their participation in political protest is the kind of action one ordinarily associates with the world's most repressive regimes. It's genuinely shocking that this appears to be what's going on right here. Universities must recognize that these actions pose an existential threat to academic life itself. They must make clear through action that they will not sit on the sidelines as the Trump administration terrorizes students and faculty alike and runs roughshod over individual rights and the rule of law, unquote. Another response comes from Wesleyan University President Michael Roth, who we just hosted in the Future Trends Forum last week. Recording's coming up soon. And over in Slate, he writes this, quote, according to Department of Homeland Security spokesperson Tricia McLaughlin, Khalil was arrested in support of President Trump's executive orders prohibiting anti-Semitism. How in the world can this be grounds for an arrest? Secretary of State Marco Rubio doubled down on this trampling of basic rights and saying that Khalil's activities were aligned with Hamas and therefore illegal. We'll be revoking the visas and our green cards of Hamas supporters in America so they can be deported, he added. So what next? Is everyone protesting the actions of Israel and Gaza going to be subject to arrest? Does having protested U.S. support for the bombing of civilians now put one at risk? Not a few Jewish students have participated in campus protests against the war in Gaza. Will they too be deemed to be in violation of the president's orders prohibiting anti-Semitism? Unquote. Again, we have links to this in the show notes. Meanwhile, in still other government agencies, the State Department announced it would use AI to determine which international students supported Hamas enough to have their visas revoked. Elsewhere, the United States Department of Agriculture, better known as USDA, suspended grants to about 20 students attending tribal colleges. Last week, you might recall some of those colleges have also had their general federal funding revoked or suspended. The USDA also, quote, temporarily paused funding to the University of Maine system. Now, turning to the Federal Emergency Management Administration, better known as FEMA, the Trump administration canceled classes at the National Fire Academy as part of a broader funding freeze. Now, at the same time, across the government, across multiple agencies, the new administration is deleting all kinds of federally hosted data, some of which academic researchers use and rely on. Now, moving down from the federal level for a moment, but staying in the same geographical area, the District of Columbia saw another echo of the Trump administration. The interim U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia, Ed Martin, told the Dean of Georgetown University Law Center to stop teaching DEI, and that he wouldn't hire any Georgetown grads if they were taught DEI. Full disclosure, I'm a senior scholar at Georgetown, although I don't do much work with its law school. Okay, all of that was just on our first header of federal action. Now we turn to cuts being undertaken by colleges and universities. We've been seeing more and more hiring freezes. Harvard and MIT have frozen hiring in response to Trump cuts, and please know how extraordinary this is. These are both very rich and high-profile institutions, especially Harvard, which is the wealthiest university in the United States, and for them to pause hiring shows just how deep these cuts are starting to bite. Many campuses are also dreading having to make cuts to come. For example, Duke University, according to ABC News, Duke's total research budget last fiscal year was $1.33 billion, with $863 million coming from the federal government. For another example, Stony Brook University is already starting to pay for grant-funded programs out of its general fund, which is not sustainable. That's going to entail cuts elsewhere or attaining extra revenue. Meanwhile, two University of South Carolina medical professors, whose last name I'm going to try and pronounce correctly, Prakash and Mitzi Nagarkati, both immunologists, husband and wife, they recently wrote that NIH cuts will be awful for the nation's health as a whole, but will fall even more harshly on red states and rural areas. Very helpfully, the University of Chicago posted an NIH indirect cost loss calculator as a website where users can generate estimates of forthcoming cuts. Now, turning to our third category, DEI, more program and staff cuts have been happening across the country. We're seeing content cuts as well. For one example, the University of Virginia ended its DEI office. But I keep hearing signs of resistance. I've heard some of them from New York and the New England area. And here's one from the West Coast, from San Bernardino Valley College. Quote, this is an official statement from them on their site, and they cite their lawyer's advice in this. Quote, educational institutions should continue to foster diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility among their student bodies. Long-standing legal precedent has established that educational institutions may take steps to build student bodies that are meaningfully diverse across numerous dimensions like geography, socioeconomic status, race, sexual orientation, gender identity, among others. Nothing in the Dear Colleague letter changes existing law and well-established legal principles that encourage and even require schools to promote educational opportunity for students of all backgrounds, unquote. So, citing law against the new administration. Now I'd like to turn to a fourth category, a new one in this series, climate change. The United States Coast Guard Academy is removing all mention of climate change from its curriculum. The website Inside Climate News put it like this. The academy that trains most of the officers of the nation's seagoing law enforcement and search and rescue has eliminated climate change and related terminology from its curriculum in an effort to conform to President Donald Trump's policies, unquote. So you have to think of the sad irony of the Coast Guard sailing up and down coasts, dealing with rising sea levels, decreasing ice, and so on, and not being able to talk about this in their instruction. And I'll just add that this is one area where the cuts to publicly hosted data are really hitting hard. Now I'd like to end by pointing out a column by University of Pennsylvania professor John Zimmerman, who's a great scholar, just a wonderful person. And he calls for all of higher education to join forces against Trump's actions. Quote, if the threatened schools spoke out together, each one would incur less danger, and their collective voice would resonate much more loudly than anything the school could say on its own. And he concludes his column by citing Benjamin Franklin. Quote, the universities need to speak out collectively just as Ben Franklin urged. If we don't hang together, we'll hang separately. Indeed, Columbia just did. Now, I'll stop there for now. That was a lot, and there's still, sadly, more coming up. If you have any responses or anything to add, if you'd like to look for help, if you just want to vent, the YouTube comment box below stands open, and I look forward to your thoughts. If you don't feel safe or comfortable commenting in public, please use my blog's content line. There's a link to that in the show notes. I hope these videos are useful and helpful to you all. This is a hard time, and it seems likely to get rougher. Please take care, everybody.